them. So today we're going to talk about West Africa's golden age or before the European invasion. Now, I think this is important simply because so many apologists have consistently said that Africans were very fortunate to have been enslaved because it civilized us, um, which I think is utterly ridiculous. But I've come to find out that there are a lot of people who really believe that. And actually, I've heard some black folks say that too. So I think it's very, very important that we talk about that. Now, I'm focusing on a specific time period and comparing that time period in Africa and specifically in West Africa with what was going on in Europe, uh, more specifically England, since we're speaking English now. And this time period is from roughly from around 400 ACE to 1500 ACE. Now, I think it's important to say that during that period of time, Europe was in the so-called Dark Ages. Some people call it the Middle Ages, but Africa was not. And again, we are focusing on West Africa because that's where the majority of Africans were kidnapped from before being uh, trafficked to the so-called New World and enslaved and so forth. Again, as I mentioned before, we're going to be doing some compare and contrast, and I think it's important to understand that Arab human trafficking, what they call the trans-Saharan slave trade, was ongoing in North Africa, East Africa, as well as the upper parts, the northern parts of West Africa from 600 AC until roughly around the time the Europeans started doing the same thing. And if you will remember, Arabs didn't get access to Africa until around 540 AC. So, again, this is just an introduction to the topic, and I'm hoping it stimulates further research. Um, the other thing that is very, very important is that a lot of the journals of the earliest Europeans to go to Africa have been made to be very obscure. They're very difficult to get to, although they are available. And the earliest European explorers in Africa, the Portuguese, noted very highly developed societies with complex political systems, and they were active participants in international trade, and they had significant scholarship. However, the materialistic Portuguese were more attracted to the gold and other things. That being said, I think it's important to note that much of the history of pre-European West Africa was documented by Muslim scholars in Arabic. And there are quite a few books that have been translated that some of the translations I'm using in this information. And some of the references that I give you, one in particular is by Michael, I think it's Michael Gomez, who is actually he's a Arabic scholar. I don't know whether he's Muslim himself, but he's a scholar of Arabic language literature. But these are some of the more commonly known and available books written by Muslim scholars. Now, I think it's also important to see that you see names like Abdul Rahman El Sadi, Al Musudi, Ibn Khaldun, Al Idrisi, Al Bakri. That those names are obviously Arabic names, but many of these people were African. I can't say who was and who wasn't at this point, but they were. So in Africa, the religion uh, during that period of time was Islam. You had a few who had converted to Christianity, and when you during the early part of this time period that I'm discussing now, the majority of the Christians were located more in North Africa, in Ethiopia. Um, Most of the Africans that we're going to talk about in the early period had their indigenous religions, whereas Europe was split between Catholic and Protestant. Um, the Catholics were the original enslavers, and then the Protestants got in on it when they saw the prophets. Uh, the social structure in much of Africa was fluid. The social mobility was not static. Um, in Europe, it was a rigid hierarchy of kings, nobles, and serfs, which is what I think the current political leadership is trying to get back to. In Africa, the literacy was predominantly oral, but in the Islamic centers that we're going to be talking about later, the literacy was higher. Um, Up to 20% in rural populations were literate, and up to 100% among the elites, whereas literacy in Europe at the same time was very low. In 1050, it was less than 1%, and up to 30% in 1500. And most of the literate people were clergy or elite people in that hierarchy. Africa was very urbanized. So often we see the pictures of Africa that shows jungle. And it's interesting because actually all the jungle is a rainforest. And if you look at forests, there's more forests in North America than there is in Africa. But that's another lecture. Um, Africa had large major cities like Timbuktu, Gao, Guinea, and Kiwa, whereas in Europe the cities were much smaller and they were much less cosmopolitan. So we're going to talk about some specific areas. Ancient Ghana, which is not to be confused with current day Ghana. Ancient Ghana lasted from around 300 AC to E to 1100 ACD. They didn't call themselves Ghana. They called themselves Ouagadougou. Um, and it was founded by a matrilineal ethnic group called the Soninkes. They spoke the Mende language, and it was located in an area that's now southeast Mauritania and parts of Mali, parts of present-day Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea, located between the Sahara and the Senegal and Niger rivers. Started out as a single kingdom, but they annexed other kingdoms and they evolved into an empire. The economic luck was that it was located at the crossroads of two main trade routes for gold, ivory, and salt. And as a result of controlling these routes, they became wealthy because they would charge taxes, import and export taxes, so that they became very, very wealthy. The capital city, Kumbisali, had two sections that were about 6 miles apart, connected by a long boulevard. And one section was for the merchants that they traded with. The other section was for the citizens of Ghana. And people lived all along the boulevard. It had a population estimated to be between 15 and 30,000. And the location was in what is now Mauritania. There were two other major cities early on, Tagaza and Wangara. The king personified the spiritual being and welfare of the people, and he derived his authority through the ancestors. Uh, his title was Tunka, and in 1065, Tunka who was the king, lived in a palace of stone and wood that was adorned with sculpture, paintings, and glass windows, as opposed to the castles in 1066 England, which were originally a large mound of earth with a wooden tower on top, wooden windows with an iron bar. Turcomenin maintained a standing army of 200,000, of which 40,000 were archers. I call that their artillery. Whereas the Norman army under William the Conqueror, who invaded England in 1066, contained fewer than 15,000 men. At its peak, the Ghana Empire had a population of several million and a territory of about 250,000 square miles. According to Al Idrisi, royalty in Ghana would feed thousands of people at a time in banquets more lavish than anything Europe had ever seen. So it would seem that greed was not a major problem. However, ancient Ghana was invaded by the Almoravids, who were Berbers from Morocco in the 11th century, and they in turn lost control afterwards, and the empire disintegrated into smaller states that were independent but weaker. Then we get Mali, who was larger. It lasted from around 1200 ACE to 1670, had its roots in Kangapa, a small state that was originally a part of Ghana. It was established by the Mandinka people that were frequently called Mandingo. It became more highly organized and administratively and politically than Ghana. The first Malian emperor was Sundiata Keita. His other name was Marijata. But Sundiata is very, very well known and celebrated leader. There are multiple books that have been written about Sundiata. He conquered Ghana and reigned from 1230 until 1255 when he died. And he expanded the empire that included Mauritania, southern Algeria in the north, and northern Nigeria in the south. Um, Ancient Mali was the first great Muslim state in the Sudan. Now, the Sudan is a geographical area south of the Sahara from west to central and eastern Africa. Sundiata actually was a practitioner of traditional African religion, but he converted to Islam as a gesture of friendship to his Islamic trading partners. Um, because of this, a lot of the Arabic writers wrote very little about him because they were very, very chauvinistic about their religion. But Sundiata gained control of the salt and gold that had been monopolized by Ghana. He captured the copper mines of Takeda. He captured the trading towns of Walata, Jenny, and Gao. He moved the capital from Jariba to Niani, and he advanced a program of agricultural expansion and actually turned a lot of soldiers into farmers so that they could have adequate food supply. Um, he was succeeded by his three sons, Wale Kieta, Wata Kieta, and Khalifa Kieta. Mansa was a title, which meant king. So it was Mansa Wali, Mansa Wati, and Mansa Khalifa. Now, Mansa Muhammad ibn Q, who was Mansa Musa's predecessor, who was also frequently called Abu Bakr II, was a great grandson of Sundiata. I'm sure you all have heard of Mansa Musa. We're going to talk about him in a minute. Um, Abu Bakr was said to have equipped 200 ships with men and another 200 with gold, water, and other provisions, and told them travel until you reach land or until you gave out of supplies. And only one ship returned, but they built up their adventure so much that um, Abu Bakr was said to have outfitted 2,000 additional ships, and he went himself and never returned. Ivan van Sertima gives considerable evidence of Mandinka influence in Mexico and Central America, as well as far north as Canada. Mansa Musa, Abu Bakr's half-brother, succeeded him, reigned 24 years, and he made Mali famous in the world, which some people think it was a big mistake. Now, Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim, but he was very tolerant toward his non-Islamic subjects. And it was noted that travelers found complete and general safety in Mali. There was no injustice and no mercy given to anyone guilty of injustice. Mansa Musa is best known for his pilgrimage, his Hajj, to Mecca in 1324. He traveled with 60,000 people, 80 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. And he gave out so much gold on the way back that the economy of Egypt slumped and didn't recover for 12 years. On the way back, he recaptured the city of Gao, and he captured the two sons of a Songhai king, Ali Kalon and Suleiman Nan. That will become important later on. Mansa Musa also rebuilt the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, which was a city famous for its mosques, palaces, trade, and university. And again, as I mentioned, some people blame his extravagant giving for attracting greedy Europeans to Africa. Under Musa, the Malian Empire was equal to the size of Western Europe, had a population of approximately 10 million. He was said to have been the richest man in the world and possibly the richest man ever because of the gold that he controlled. I think it's important that we ask the question, was it his gold or was it the wealth of the people? And understanding the governance systems, that's a question that could stand some discussion. The city Jenny also had great universities, and they were fully supported by Musa. His administration had secretaries, officers, and upon his death, he was succeeded by his son Magan, who died after 4 years and was succeeded by his uncle Suleiman. Mali began to decline in around 1400 ACE and was attacked by the Mosi, the Tuaregs, and the Berbers, and by Sunni Ali of Songhai. Now, Songhai was the largest and greatest of all the Western Sudanic empires, lasted from around 1450 to 1750. And the people were the Songhai people. And although it traded in gold, salt, and leather, I was surprised when I initially did this research because they were saying the biggest industry was books. Uh, it was the size of two-thirds of, it was larger than continental Europe, and took up two-thirds of West Africa, almost 550,000 square miles. And that took in portions of Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, and Nigeria today. And they had a naval fleet, and the houses were typically 2 stories with upstairs toilets. Um, the foundation of Songhai was laid by Sunni Ali Burr, who was also a great hero. Now, who was Sunni Ali Burr? Burr translates as the Great. Um, and he was actually Ali Cologne, one of the princes that was taken by Musa when he conquered Songhai um, during the heyday of Mali. And shortly after Musa died, Soli Ali Cologne and his brother Suleiman Nar escaped. So when he reigned, during his reign, he expanded the empire, improved the organization of the government and administration compared to Mali. Again, he was officially Muslim, but he practiced traditional African religion. And you found that in the metropolitan areas, in the towns and cities, most of the people were Muslim, but most of the people in the countryside were practitioners of traditional religion. And this may have been his undoing because a lot of the people revolted. He recaptured Timbuktu in 1468. He captured Jenny. And when his Muslim subjects finally revolted, they elevated Askia Muhammad Touré, who was his nephew, to the throne. Askia Touré was Sunni Ali's sister. And remember, they were matrilineal. He was his sister's son, was Sunni Ali's sister's son. And he built an effective army out of prisoners of war and enslaved people who he freed and put in service to the empire. He built the largest empire in the history of West and Central Africa, which was as big as the Indian subcontinent. He built and or improved universities in Gao, Guinea, and Timbuktu that had actual medical schools and law schools. He created a highly centralized government made up of chiefs who headed various departments, um, much like cabinet members. He established an organized tax system. He established standardized trade measures and regulators. He initiated the policing of trade routes. Uh, he was said to have had more than 400 children. I don't know how true that is, but I saw that in more than one reference. He was deposed by his son Musa, who actually turned out to be a very weak leader. Another of the kingdoms was Kanem-Bornu, which was originally separate kingdoms, but they merged to form an empire. And the people who made up the empire were the Zagawa and the Kanuri. The early ruler, the title, they were the Maize, and existed in areas that are now part of Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, Libya, and Chad. It was a contemporary of Ghana, and its strength and wealth also lay in trading. They developed durable institutions for government, military power, scholarship, diplomacy, agriculture, and urban life. It lasted from the 8th century until 1900, although written records began in the 9th century. There were 2 dynasties, the Dugawa dynasty and the Sefua dynasty. The first king, again, practiced traditional African religion, as did his successors, and the Sefuas were Islamic. The final period of Kanem-Bornu began in 1571 with the reign of Mai Idris Aluma. He expanded the empire and was a contemporary of Queen Elizabeth I. The House estates were located in what is now northern Nigeria. There were seven of them: Biram, Dura, Gabir, Kano, Katsina, Rano, and Zaria. They were all individual city-states. Uh, it was interesting that Kano was actually originally a part of Songhai. They never centralized, they never formed an empire, but they were just a loose confederation of independent states that sometimes cooperated for common objectives and sometimes didn't. Originally, Katsina was the lead state, but Kano became the lead state by the 16th century, was the seat of government, trade, and scholarship, and was among the most important of the West African states. The Kano Chronicles were a collection of Hausa traditions and stated that the Fulani people migrated into Hausa land and brought additional knowledge. I found that to be interesting because if you know anything about Nigeria, the majority of the majority of people in the largest ethnic group in Nigeria is the Hausa, and they coexist with the Fulani. And it's interesting because my maternal DNA shows that I have some Fulani um, DNA. Significant cities in West Africa. We talked about empires, but a lot of times people say the name Timbuktu without realizing that it was a really uh, important place and it was real. And it was an important part of both Mali and Songhai. And in the 14th century, it had a population of about 115,000, whereas London in the 14th century had a population of around 20,000. Um, Timbuktu flourished due to trade in salt, gold, ivory, books, and human beings. It had 26 textile factories where each master tailor employed anywhere between 50 and 100 apprentices. It was the home of Sankore Madrasa and other universities that had a flourishing book trade. Um, Sankore Madrasa is frequently called the University of Sankora, and it was built around 1300 ACE, had 25,000 students from all over the world at the height of the Songhai. And at that same time, London had no universities. Oxford and Cambridge were the only universities in England, but they weren't in London. The students paid lecturers in money, clothing, cows, poultry, and services. A lot of books from this university survive today, and many of them are as old as dating to the 7th century ACE. National Geographic estimates that uh, 700,000 manuscripts of books survived in Timbuktu, not to mention more than 1 million in private collections and that exist in other West African countries. There were public libraries in the city, and Sankore wasn't the only university. Um, there were two other mosques that were educational sites for the study of Islamic law and theology. I can't really talk about Timbuktu unless we talk about Ahmed Baba. Ahmed Baba was a very prominent scholar, born to a family of scholars, and he was the last head of the university before the fall of Songhai. He actually wrote more than 40 books on various topics, including law, Arabic grammar, and philosophy, and is said to have owned a library of 1,600 books. When Sankore was defeated by Moors and Moroccans in 1596, a lot of the scholars were executed, but he was taken to Marrakesh, where he remained in chains for up to 4 years, but he was eventually released and allowed to teach at the mosque in Marrakesh. He was released from that eventually and allowed to return home to Timbuktu, where he later died. Um, he directly influenced many scholars, including Abdul Rahman al-Sadi, who wrote History of the Sudan. The Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu today, it was established in 1970, has almost 30,000 books that are being studied, cataloged, and preserved. Uh, the Tariq el Fatash described Timbuktu thusly, and I quote, Timbuktu has no equal among cities of the blacks and was known for its solid institutions, political liberties, purity of morals, security of its people and their goods, compassion towards the poor and strangers, as well as courtesy and generosity towards students and scholars, end quote. That's high praise for that time period. Another significant city in West Africa was Guinea. It was first settled around 200 BCE, but the city itself was founded in the 8th century and was a walled city of two gates by the 16th century. Uh, had, had a 15th century population of 40,000, and London had a population of 40 to 70,000 before the Black Death. Jenny was a prosperous trading center in salt and gold and was home of advanced culture. And it had a medical school, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, where surgeons successfully removed cataracts from the human eye in the 12th century. It was said to have had thousands of teachers and was a gathering place. Gao was the earliest mention by Arab is in the early 9th century. The rulers converted to Islam in the 11th century, and it was a major part of both the Mali and Songhai Empire. It was actually the political and military center of Songhai, described by Muslim travelers as being, quote, one of the finest, biggest, and most fertile cities of the Sudan, end quote. Leo Africanus, who has written quite a bit on Africa, described it. The town is very civilized compared to Timbuktu, end quote. In the 16th century, there were 7,626 houses, not counting straw huts, with an estimated population of around 45,000. Had buildings with glass windows. The tomb of Askia Muhammad is in Gao, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Subsequent empires, Messina, founded by Ahmad Lobo, and was one of the largest empires in West Africa after the fall of Songhai. It was led by a parliament which was called the Great Council, which was made up of scholar administrators. These were learned men. Uh, Higher education was fully institutionalized by the government, and the population was 1 to 1.5 million, but the capital city, Hamdulillah, had 10 to 15,000 permanent residents, mostly scholars, soldiers, and government officials. Then you had the Empire of Sokoto, which was founded by Usman Dan Fodio in 1809, conquered by the British in 1903 under Frederick Lugard. Just to name some other important pre-colonial empires, the Asante, the Yoruba, the Jollof, Monomotapa, which was in southern Africa, Kush, Aksum, and Zulu. Um, Now, these are only a few of the empires. There were many, many more all over Africa. So, looking at that, were the kidnapped Africans really fortunate to be enslaved? Why did the Africans enslave each other? And again, we're gonna maybe next year when we do this, I think I'm going to add a couple of lectures if it's feasible. One to talk about slavery. Um, so how did the Europeans defeat the Africans in their home? Because Africans were actually kicking European butt until the introduction of the Maxim and Gatling gun. Uh, so these are my references. And if you can hold on for a minute, I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. Uh, these are actually two major um, references, and they're both old. Um, Introduction to African Civilizations by John G. Jackson and The Destruction of Black Civilization. Well, another reason that I mentioned these two first, not only because they were uh, some of the first excellent references, but both these authors are South Carolinians. John G. Jackson was from Aiken, and he taught at several schools in Chicago and at in New York. And Chancellor Williams was from Bennettsville, and he taught at Howard University. Um, I might add that Chancellor Williams actually, the way he did his research was he traveled through Africa and talked to the elders and the scholars, rather than depending on what Europeans had written. Robin Walker is a British scholar who has this book, When We Rule, has close to 2,000 pages. It's an excellent reference. Michael Gomez, who I mentioned earlier, is an Arabic scholar. Um, and this book is based on his interpretation of a lot of the Arabic books that were written by the scholars that we mentioned earlier. Howard French wrote a book, Born in Blackness, which I think is very important reading for anyone interested in West Africa. Topics in West African History by Adu Borhan. Um, Adu Borhan was a very respected Ghanaian historian. I was fortunate to be able to meet him in I think it was 1993, either 1996, 1996, during a trip to Ghana with Asa Hilliard and Jacob Carruthers. Um, this History of West Africa is a book that I bought when I was there. I don't know the author, but it also gives some really, really good information. Sundiata, an epic of old Mali, gives some stories of, and here's some others. Chinwezu, a Nigerian scholar, The West and the Rest of Us, White Predators, Black Slaves and the African Elite. Dr. John Henry Clark wrote an article on Ahmed Baba, um, Basil Davidson, Sheikh Anta Diop, uh, and Ivan Van Sertima, Robin Walker, and the a reference that I don't have here is the UNESCO series on Africa. I think there were originally 7 volumes. I've been told that 2 subsequent volumes have been published. I can't get to them. I'm looking for them. But I want to thank you all for your patience, and hopefully we'll be able to have some Q&A next week or this Sunday for the last lecture. And that lecture will be uh, uh, resistance to slavery. Um,